So I don't think most of you need an introduction for John Love. He's one of our brothers, and I think most of us know who he is. But what a lot of you may not know is that John has had a passionate interest in the opposite of evolution in the creation for most of his life, and a culmination of his work for a long, long time. He's just recently published a book. The book is called The Death of Evolution, and so he wanted to share with us tonight some ideas along the way, or maybe towards the end in a question and answer sort of thing. We'll probably make a few more comments about the idea that there are those who have other ideas. However, the biblical account as it's written is what we the elders here support. And so without further ado, at this point in time, I'm going to let John come up and tell us about what he's learned all these years.
Well, thank you, Chris. And thank you all for being here tonight. I'm looking very forward to this. Like Chris said, this is a passion of mine. I'm very passionate about God's creation. I'm very passionate about Genesis 1. And he mentioned my book. In my book, to my grandchildren. And I say, may God always govern your heart. And I dedicate this speech tonight to our dynamic youth, although my vision's bad, I'm having a hard time seeing them. But I hope that they will watch the video, and I want them to know that this is dedicated to them, and may their hearts always be governed by the Lord. My book titled The Death of Evolution was just published. It was presented to my publisher over a year ago. Since that time, my study on this subject continues, and my speech tonight is a culmination of research I have done in my interpretation, opinions, and logical conclusions from the science. Now let's talk a little history. In the history of the world, two major atheistic propositions have been proposed with regard to the origin and evolution of life. The second of which is Charles Darwin's proposition that natural selection gave us the creatures that we have today, including Homo sapiens, that being me and you. The first major proposition of atheism was spontaneous generation, which was elucidated by the Greek philosopher Aristotle 300 years before the birth of Christ. Spontaneous generation is all about abiogenesis, that is, living creatures arise from non-living matter. Aristotle's proposition arose as he noted the instances of creatures in environments previously lacking such creatures, such as the seemingly sudden appearance of tadpoles in a fresh body of water. Spontaneous generation enjoyed fame and glory among evolutionists into the 17th century, when scientists undertook additional experimentation to either support or disprove it. By this time, the proponents of spontaneous generation cited how frogs just simply seemed to appear along the banks of the Nile River in Egypt during the annual flooding. Others observed that mice could arise among grain stored in barns with thatched roofs. When the roof would leak and the grain would mold, mice appeared. In another example, Jan-Baptista van Helmont, a 17th century Flemish scientist, proposed that mice could arise among rags and wheat kernels left in an open container for 3 weeks. It was also believed that maggots were produced from decaying meat. However, Italian physician Francisco Redi, that's spelled R-E-D-I, performed an experiment in 1668, which was one of the first to refute the idea that maggots spontaneously generate. He suspected that maggots were the larvae of flies, and preventing flies from having direct contact with the meat would prevent the appearance of maggots. Redi put meat in each of 6 containers. 2 were left to the open air, 2 were gauze covered, and 2 were tightly sealed. His hypothesis was supported when maggots appeared in the containers left to the open air, but no maggots appeared in either the gauze-covered or tightly sealed containers, dealing a serious blow to spontaneous generation. And then almost 200 years later, in 1859, Louis Pasteur took a series of gooseneck flasks in which he boiled broth in order to sterilize them. The design of the flask allowed air on the inside of the flask to be exchanged with air on the outside, but prevented the intrusion of any microbial growth which would get caught in the bend of the neck. The eventual finding was that the broth did not produce life. Pasteur's set of experiments irrefutably disproved spontaneous generation and earned him the prestigious Alhambra Prize from the Paris Academy of Sciences in 1862. So what do we have? We've got frogs spontaneously generating along the banks of the Nile River in Egypt during the annual flooding. We've got mice spontaneously generating among grain stored in barns. We've got mice spontaneously generating among rags and wheat kernels, and we've got maggots spontaneously generating among decaying meat, or from decaying meat. This was the best atheistic science of the day. Spontaneous generation was being proposed by some of the world's leading atheistic scientists, and this was just 200 plus years ago. Now, looking back, we know that mice don't spontaneously generate among grain stored in barns, and we know maggots don't spontaneously generate from decaying meat, and consequently, we know that the best atheistic science of the 18th century cannot be trusted. You know, just to illustrate my point, let me take us all on a little trip. I'm going to ask you to use your imaginations here. Let's say I've got my fictitious time machine parked out back here, and I'm going to take us all to a beautiful, ornate Victorian auditorium in the 18th century, and you're going to hear a series of lectures given by some of the world's leading atheistic scientists telling you things like frogs, mice, and maggots spontaneously generate. Now, I know you are a respectful group and you would not laugh out loud during the middle of these lectures, but I do believe some of you might be tempted to. See, what we know today is that the best atheistic science of the 17th and 18th century is laughable, and that begs the question. If the best atheistic science of the 17th and 18th century is laughable, can the best atheistic science of the day be trusted? Well, celebrated philosopher and journalist Malcolm Muggeridge doesn't think so. He said, "I myself am convinced that the theory of evolution, especially to the extent of which it's been applied, will become one of the great jokes in the history books of the future." He went on to say that posterity will marvel that such a very flimsy and dubious hypothesis could be believed with the incredible credulity that it has. Well, Louis Pasteur irrefutably disproved spontaneous generation in 1859, but just as the first major proposition of atheism was being disproven, the second major proposition of atheism was gaining great support because in the same year, 1859, Charles Darwin published his book titled On the Origin of Species. Folks, it was like it was a relay race, and spontaneous generation handed off the atheistic baton to Darwinian evolution. Well, I got to tell you a funny story. In February 1999, famed Chinese paleontologist Dr. J.Y. Chen was invited to the University of Washington, Spokane, to give a lecture. And during the lecture, he presented a number of beautiful, fully formed fossils from the Cambrian strata with complete body plans, just like we would see them today, and no evolutionary precursors from the lower Cambrian strata. He held his hand out like this, and he said Darwin got it wrong. He said what the evidence from the Cambrian shows is that life, rather than emanating as a single-cell organism into all the creatures that we have today, and then he held his hand upside down like this, he said, what the evidence from the Cambrian shows is that life emanated as a great orchard with many different trees. And by the way, that's the same description given to us in the book of Genesis. Well, after the lecture, there was a Q&A. And this earth scientist, who was also an atheist, stood up and he said, Dr. Chen, great lecture, love the fossils. He said, however, aren't you just a little uncomfortable questioning Charles Darwin, especially coming from an authoritarian country like China? And even though Dr. Chen's home country had just been insulted, well, he didn't miss a beat. He said, sir, in China, we question Charles Darwin. We just cannot question the government. He said, however, in America, you can question the government. You just cannot question Charles Darwin. Well, Charles Darwin was an interesting fellow. He led an interesting life like all of us. He had his ups and downs. At one point in his life, he was perhaps one of the best-known people on the planet. Yet during his adult life, he suffered from numerous serious maladies, such as acute gastrointestinal problems. He had frequent bouts of anxiety. He also had eczema. He also had 10 children, 3 of which he lost, one of which was reputed to be his favorite daughter. He was born into affluence. His father, Robert, was a medical doctor. His fraternal grandfather, his father, Robert, was a medical doctor. His fraternal grandfather, Erasmus, was a medical doctor, and his maternal grandfather was none other than Josiah Wedgwood, who started the Wedgwood Company in 1759, and it's still going strong today. Some of you, or maybe some of your moms or some of your grandmothers, might have some of the plates and saucers made by the Wedgwood Company, many of which are collector's items. And speaking of the Wedgwood family, Charles Darwin would eventually marry Emma Wedgwood, his first cousin. And I know what some of you are thinking, and the answer is no. Darwin was from England, not Alabama. I might get excommunicated for that one. Well, at 16 years old, Darwin enrolled into medical school at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, to follow in the footsteps of his father and grandfather. However, a problem arose. The sight of blood, the sight of disease, the sight of an open carcass made Charles sick as a dog, so he dropped out of medical school and transferred to Christ College in Cambridge to study the ministry, with the idea in mind of becoming a country parson. Shortly after graduation, the Darwin family did what many affluent families did, and they sent their boy on a world tour for more education, learning, and refinement. Charles Darwin boarded the HMS Beagle with a copy of Charles Lyell's book in his suitcase. Charles Lyell was a geologist, and his book was titled The Principles of Geology. Charles Lyell was greatly consumed with the concept of natural selection, and some of his writings rocked Darwin's faith. When the HMS Beagle was on its return voyage, it stopped at the Galapagos Islands, which is about 600 miles west of Ecuador. When Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands in the 1830s, he observed the finches that lived in the various islands and that their big sizes and shapes varied island by island. He believed this was evidence of evolution by nature selecting the fittest birds to survive because certain types of beaks were better suited for gathering the food sources available on the different islands. However, our latest science, especially our latest science of genetics, has now shown us that Darwin's single best evidence for evolution, Darwin's finches, does not support evolution. Modern studies have tracked over 1,000 finches that have lived in either rural or urban environments to determine how and why their beak sizes and shapes would differ based on where they lived. These studies revealed that the significant differences in beak depth and width between rural and urban populations was caused by epigenetic mechanisms, such as DNA methylation. Methyl tags change the way a gene is expressed without changing its DNA. This mechanism enables rapid adaptation in finch beaks and other traits as they fit their new environments, even over a couple of generations. So rather than Darwin's evolutionary ideas explaining the changes in finches, the changes bespeak of a master engineer who designed creatures with built-in adaptive mechanisms whereby they can turn on and off certain features as they continuously track environmental changes. The discovery of DNA methylation is often attributed to American biochemist and geneticist Dr. Rollin Hotchkiss from his work done in the late 1940s. The epigenome is a multitude of chemical compounds and proteins that regulate the genome. DNA methylation happens when these chemical compounds and proteins attach to DNA and direct such actions, such as turning genes on or off. This happens once a creature detects, and keep that word in mind, detects. This happens once a creature detects what scientists call environmental stress, which is a change in the environment. Another factor triggering the epigenomic mechanism is the preference for a particular food. Geneticists found that beaks changed as the finches developed different tastes for fruit, seeds, or insects picked from the ground or cacti. Long pointed beaks made some of them more fit for picking seeds out of cactus fruits, whereas larger, broader beaks served best for eating seeds found on the ground. In 1977, a drought hit the Galapagos Islands, and because of the drought, tough seeds were just about the only readily available finch food. As a rule, finches with smaller beaks could not crack open the seeds and mostly starved, whereas finches with larger, broader beaks could crack open the seeds and survived. And then in 1982 and 1983, higher than normal rainfall stimulated the drought-stressed plants to rebound, and the island developed a lush environment, a better environment. As a result of the increase in seed availability and softer seeds, finch numbers increased, including a preponderance of finches with smaller beaks. Curious to find the answers, geneticists and biologists got involved, including biologist Dr. Michael Skinner. Blood was taken and genomes were studied. What the scientists found was what we've been talking about, was that the beaks went from large to small to large again. Let me give you an example here. Oh, there it is. As a result of the epigenomic mechanism and DNA methylation. Now, if you just want to bottom line the epigenomic mechanism and DNA methylation, it is all about internal detection and adaptation. Some scientists refer to this process as continuous environmental tracking, whereas others refer to it as pre-programmed adaptability. Now, did these finches get this pre-programmed adaptability at birth? Well, of course not. Did these finches get this pre-programmed adaptability at conception? Not really. These finches got this pre-programmed adaptability on day 5 of creation, when God, knowing that his environment would be forever changing, installed into his creatures pre-programmed adaptability. The Galapagos finches that we just discussed was one of the first major evolutionary icons disproven by our latest science. Now let's look at another evolutionary icon disproven by our latest science, the Bistine betullaria, also known as the peppered moth from England. In 1760, the Industrial Revolution in England began. Coal-fired factories belched out volumes of black smoke and soot that settled on housetops, fences, and trees. A change in the peppered moth was also noted. The peppered moths come in 2 different varieties, either dark-colored wings or either light-colored wings with dark speckles or dark-colored wings with light speckles. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, 98% of all peppered moths were of the light-colored variety. They got their name peppered moth because it looked like somebody sprinkled pepper on their light-colored wings. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, a higher percentage of peppered moths with dark wings began to emerge. And then in 1956, the Clean Air Act was passed, and shortly thereafter, a higher percentage of peppered moths with light wings began to emerge. In 1953, 3 years prior to the Clean Air Act, entomologist and evolutionist Dr. Bernard Kettlewell began a series of studies on the peppered moth with Darwinian natural selection as his agenda. And if you think I'm being too rough on Dr. Kettlewell, well, let me repeat something he once said. He said, if Darwin were only alive today and could see my experiments, he would witness the consummation and confirmation of his life's work. Kettlewell was proposing that birds were eating the lesser camouflage moths in support of natural selection. However, rather than photographing the pepper moths in their natural environments and doing their pepper moth things, he staged the scene by gluing a dead, dark-winged peppered moth. We've lost it. There it is. He staged the scene by gluing a dead light-winged peppered moth and a dead dark-winged peppered moth to a darkened tree trunk to show that birds could more easily spot the peppered moths with light-colored wings, and they'd be the more likely prey. However, there's a number of problems with Kettlewell's work. Problem number 1, peppered moths do not dwell on tree trunks. And problem number 2, peppered moths do not dwell on tree trunks during the day. They are nocturnal. And problem number 3, birds have been found not to be the main predator of the peppered moth, but maybe a secondary predator at best. See, birds and peppered moths are on 2 totally different time schedules. Peppered moths are nocturnal. They sleep on the underside of leaves and on the underside of horizontal tree limbs during the day, and they fly at night. Birds sleep at night and fly during the day. What Dr. Jonathan Wells, among others, has found is that bats are the main predator of the peppered moth. And the cute thing that came out of his study was the fact that bats do not care what color the wings are of the peppered moth, since they use echolocation to seek out their prey. Well, very avid atheist, very vocal atheist, Dr. Jerry Cohen, professor at the University of Chicago, when he first heard rumors of Kettlewell's work supporting natural selection, he was absolutely elated. But then he got to digging into the details of Kettlewell's work, and here's what he had to say. He said, "My own reaction resembles the dismay attending my discovery at the age of 6 that it was my father and not Santa who was putting the gifts under the tree on Christmas Eve." Well, the real death blow to Kettlewell's work came in more recent years when the microbiologists got involved, such as microbiologist Drs. Van Hoff and Sakari. They also wanted to know why the pepper moth's wings went from light to dark and dark to light again. They studied the genomes of the peppered moth, and here's their finding and conclusion. They concluded that the reason the wings were going from light to dark and dark to light again was due to the conservation of a developmental master switch for melanism. Now let's break that statement down. Let's take the last word first. The more melanin you have in your skin, the darker it is. The more melanin you have in your eyes, the darker they are. Let's look at that first word next, conservation. That's just something you keep, something you maintain, maybe an internal trait that you have, you got from your parents, they got from their parents, they got from their parents, and so forth and so on down the line. Now let's look at that phrase, developmental master switch. What that is talking about is the same thing that was going on with the Darwin's finches, and it's the same thing going on with the pepper moth. It is all about the epigenomic mechanism, DNA methylation, and pre-programmed adaptability. Now, did these moths get this pre-programmed adaptability at birth? Well, of course not. Did these moths get this pre-programmed adaptability at conception? Not really. These moths got this pre-programmed adaptability on day 5 of creation, when God, knowing that his environment would be forever changing, installed into his creatures pre-programmed adaptability. Well, how about one more example? I'll keep this one short, but you got to allow me a little humor here. In the autumn of every year, Daddy Bird detects that the days are getting shorter. So Daddy Bird says to Mama Bird, "Pack up the kids. We're flying to Florida." That's pre-programmed adaptability. Well, I've mentioned natural selection. Let's talk about natural selection. Evolutionists propose that natural selection enables such things like dinosaurs to evolve into birds over millions of years. Now let's examine that. The term natural selection is another way of saying nature selects. The word selection connotes the thought of choosing between 2 or more variants. Nature does not have the volition to choose between 2 or more variants. Nature has an IQ of 0. It does not have the volition to choose between 2 or more variants, but the creature does. An example of this is this study that's been done over and over again for years and years on the wolves that live in northern Canada and other frigid parts of the globe. When an unusually cold winter happens, some of the wolves do in fact freeze to death, some move further south, and the ones that stay and survive grow longer, thicker, darker fur. See, nature provides cues. Nature provides stimuli. Nature provides triggers. But what the latest evidence, what the latest science has found is that it is the creature, or more appropriately, the genome of the creature that does the selecting. An example of natural selection that atheists and evolutionists like to use is the situation in Africa, and we've all seen this on the Nature Channel. It's a situation where a lion or a tiger is chasing down this herd of gazelles, and they catch one. It's perhaps the slowest, it might be the sickliest one, might be the oldest one. Let's say that the initial herd had 30 gazelles. One got eaten, so now we've got 29. Yes, I'm good at math. Now we've got 29. Can it be argued that this herd of 29 is, as a group, healthier than the 30? You know what? Sure, why not? But ever since the beginning of time, all we have ever observed is that gazelles produce gazelles. And I predict, even though this group of 29 is healthier than the 30, I predict in the future that gazelles will still produce gazelles. See, it has never been proven that natural selection is the engine that drives evolution, and evolution has never been observed. In 1990, the Human Genome Project was started, and it was launched on both sides of the Atlantic. The goal of the Human Genome Project was to map and sequence the entire human genome. And this project was successfully completed 13 years later in 2003. Just prior to 2018, in an effort to prove Darwinian common descent and a genetic similarity among all species, evolutionists Drs. Mark Stokel and David Thaler applied for and got a very generous government grant and conducted the largest DNA study ever done. They took the same section of mitochondria DNA from 100,000 species, including humans. And what they found was that there was no intergenetic relationship among all the species. And the really interesting thing that you can do with this kind of study is that you can analyze the mutations and you can get a timeline on when a creature came on the scene. And they found that animals and humans came on the scene about the same time. This study, done by evolutionists, pretty much disproves Darwinian common descent, and it supports the evidence for a special creation. In 1960, South African Dr. Philip Tobias, along with his colleague Dr. Ronald Clark, discovered 14 fossil pieces which were the remains of an Australopithecus afarensis skull. The Australopithecus afarensis is just a small ape. Dr. Philip Tobias asked Dr. Ronald Clark to reassemble the skull. It's a skill at which Dr. Clark was reputed to be very good at. After the assembly was done, he brought the skull to Dr. Tobias, at which point Dr. Tobias got really disgruntled and said, "No, I need for it to be bigger." And Dr. Clark said, "No, I'm not going to make it bigger. It is what it is." Dr. Tobias went behind Dr. Clark's back to a graduate student and said, "Here, take this skull and make it bigger." To which he did, placing plaster of Paris in between the skull fragments. The Australopithecus afarensis stands approximately 3 feet to 3.5 feet tall and has a brain size of a maximum of 500 cc's, really more like 400 cc's, whereas the average human brain is a minimum of 1,300 cc's. After the graduate student finished with the fossil skull, it was 700 cc's. Dr. Tobias was elated because he wanted to show an ape progressing toward a human. He named the fossil Homo habilis, and even though Homo habilis has been found to be a fraud, it is still in biology textbooks and natural history museums today. After Philip Tobias' death, Dr. Ronald Clark revealed the fraud in a video clip that can be found on the web. Dynamic youth, we are Homo sapiens. What the evolutionists say that prior to us was Homo erectus, and prior to that was Homo habilis that we just discussed. These are all supposed to be transitional creatures. Now let's talk about Homo erectus. In 1896, Dr. Eugene Dubois, I'm sure I'm slaughtering that word, it's D-U-B-O-I-S, found a skull cap, not a full skull, but just a skull cap, a single molar tooth and an upper leg bone on Java Island, Indonesia. Dr. Dubois did not find any facial bones, hand bones, or foot bones, but with Darwinian evolution as his agenda, imagined these bones in an ape-like creature and named it Homo erectus. 4 years later, in 1900, using imagination and plaster of Paris, he presented a life-size creature at the World's Fair in Paris with an ape-like protruding snout, even though his find did not have any facial bones. Dr. Dubois, his reconstruction, had an ape-like opposable toe, even though no foot bones were found, and his reconstruction had large ape-like fingers, even though no hand bones were found. Also, the color of the plaster, okay, moving ahead, 1984, Dr. Richard Leakey found an almost complete skeleton that he described as Homo erectus. Using imagination, plaster of Paris, and a Darwinian agenda, moved the facial bones outward to give it a more ape-like protruding snout. Also, the color of the plaster did not completely match that of the skull. What was discovered also was that the photographs Leakey supplied to his colleagues in the public of Homo erectus were photoshopped, showing the color of the skeleton and the plaster to be the same. Dr. Leakey passed away in 2022, but prior to his death was contacted by Dr. Carl Werner, who asked him if Homo erectus was a forgery. Dr. Leakey admitted that he had wrongly altered the facial features of the skeleton to give it a more ape-like snout. Evolutionists need transitional fossils to prove evolution. They have no transitional fossils, so they have to commit fraud with hopes it will fool their colleagues and the public, which it does. The ape-to-man transitional figures, Homo habilis and Homo erectus, have been revealed to be a fraud. And once again, evolutionists are left with no transitional fossils and no transitional creatures. The whole of evolutionary theory depends on a single great factor, and that is the existence of transitional fossils and or transitional creatures. In Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species, he writes, innumerable transitional forms must have existed. Why then don't we find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? What is a transitional fossil or creature? It is a creature that is in transition, changing from what it is or from what it was into something new. For instance, some evolutionists contend that hippos, since they like to play in water, slowly evolve into whales over millions and millions of years. As far as hippos evolving into whales, evolutionist and marine biologist Dr. E.J. Schlepper said there are no transitions between land animals and whales. In the late 1970s, Harvard paleontologist Dr. Stephen J. Gould said that Darwinian evolution was dead and that the great secret of paleontology is the fact that there are no transitional fossils. Also in the late 1970s, the curator at the Museum of Natural History, Dr. Colin Patterson, wrote a book titled Evolution. After he wrote the book and it was published, a friend of his wrote to him and said, Dr. Patterson, where are the sketches, where are the pictures of the transitional fossils or the transitional creatures? To which Dr. Patterson said, if I knew of any, I would have certainly included them in my book. See, and this statement by Dr. Patterson is huge because he was the chief paleontologist of the British Museum of Natural History and later the curator. The British Museum of Natural History houses the largest collection of fossils in the world, over 80,000, whereas the Smithsonian only has 40,000. And perhaps the most telling of the evidence, or lack thereof, Charles Darwin writes in his Origin of the Species, talking about the large number of creatures that have lived and died since the beginning of time must be, what he said the number of creatures since the beginning of time that have lived and died must be enormous. And he uses the word extermination for the word death. He says, speaking of about the large number of creatures that have lived and died since the beginning of time must be enormous, he says, but just in proportion as this process of extermination of immediate varieties which formerly existed must be truly enormous. And then, why then is not every geological formation in every stratum full of such intermediate links? Then he says, geology assuredly does not reveal any finely graduated organic chain. And he said, and this is perhaps the gravest objection that could be raised against my theory. In my book, in the final chapter, when I'm summing things up, I make the statement, you can pound on the podium for the Big Bang, you can pound on the podium for electrometric dating, but if you don't have transitional fossils, if you don't have transitional creatures, then you don't have evolution. I want to thank you all for your very kind attention.